All right, Sam, let's go ahead and jump into it. Welcome, everyone, to the How I Automate My Work with AI webinar series. This is our fourth episode of the week. So if you're just catching up, all of our previous sessions have been posted on YouTube. They've been really, really great so far. But today, I'm very excited to be joined by Sam from Janie and Jack. Sam, thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
Absolutely. Just to give everyone a little overview of what to expect today, we'll kick off with some quick intros and learn a bit about Sam's career before we jump into just enough context on Parabola so you know exactly what Sam's showing you as we walk through these flows. The first use case we're going to talk about is multi-carrier invoice parsing. This is a really cool flow where Sam actually has one workflow parsing multiple invoice formats from a variety of carriers all in a single flow. And then we'll talk about inbound logistics tracking as well. We'll round out with about 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A, so feel free to drop questions in the chat with that we go. But without further ado, my name is Adam Ricefield. I lead product marketing here at Parabola, and today I'm joined by Sam. Sam, we'll give you a chance to introduce yourself as well.
Great. So again, thanks for having me. I'm Sam. I am now newly at Janie and Jack. I come from a line of operations in my career. I've worked at Hatch Collection. Before that, I worked at a small costume jewelry company named Fallon, and actually started my career thinking I was going to be a lawyer. So done a couple of hops, but ops is really where I found my calling. I got to the Janie and Jack team actually through an acquisition of Hatch Collection. So what's really awesome is right now the bulk of what I handle is Janie and Jack, but I still have my hands touching a little bit of Hatch Collection. So it's really awesome since that's where the bulk of my career has been in operations. And I'm excited to show you guys Parabola.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. For those who maybe are not familiar, can you share a little bit about what Janie and Jack does as a business and kind of the
Yeah,
scale at which you're operating?
sure. So Janie and Jack is a children's apparel company. They have about 120 stores and e-commerce and a small wholesale business. It's a 200 million plus business, so not small. Lots of moving parts, and it's been around for around 20ish years. So it has a very good following, and they're close as a mom myself with two toddlers. It's really cute stuff. So I love working there.
That's amazing. Well, we're lucky to have you here today, Sam. And before we jump into some of those flows that we mentioned, I'm just going to spend about 2 minutes giving everyone a quick overview of Parabola. If you've joined already this week, you've seen this before, but appreciate you sticking through. Right now, we are in the canvas looking at a flow, and Parabola is an AI-enabled workflow builder where you can really organize and transform messy data from anywhere, whether that is email, spreadsheets, PDFs, APIs, databases, you name it, so that you can ultimately automate the work that you always thought would be manual. The four kind of fundamental steps in Parabola are first, steps to pull in data. So this could be, your messy PDF, which we'll look at more in a bit, or it could be systems in your stack like NetSuite, Google Sheets, SharePoint, you name it. Once we've actually pulled in data from everywhere in your tech stack for your process, the next step is transforming it, basically doing everything you'd otherwise do in a spreadsheet. Those are going to be things like cleaning your data, combining it across sources, maybe joining based on something like SKU. And then we also can use custom transform steps, which are steps where you can just type in instructions, and then Parabola uses AI to translate your instructions into custom code that we apply against your data set, and then provide you with a little overview of exactly how your data is being transformed step by step. Third, we have steps to actually action on our data. That could be sending an email, creating a visualization, pushing data back to Shopify or Google Sheets. And then finally, we have cards to actually document our process as we go. So beyond all of these pieces of documentation, we also can zoom in on any given step and see the AI generated documentation on a single step so anyone can really quickly understand what's happening in a flow. Last thing I'll mention, if you're starting from scratch, you can just type in what you want to build, and Parabola will actually help you put steps on the canvas and build that workflow from scratch. So here I'm asking for help building a packing list reconciliation between a PDF and Ship Hero, and Parabola's tapping into our collection of knowledge, adding the right steps directly to the canvas, and providing you with an overview of exact how you'd like to build that flow. Sam, before I kick it over back to you, when you're describing Parabola to your teammates at Janie and Jack, is there anything that you also mentioned that maybe I missed there?
No, I actually was making sure that you were going to talk about the co-builder. I think the co-builder is honestly the coolest thing that you guys have done thus far, and has actually very much helped me with the flow that we'll go into first. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And we'll definitely talk more about that as we get into our first flow here, which is multi-carrier invoice parsing. Sam, can you tell us a little bit about what this is and why this has been a challenge?
Yes. So we at Janie and Jack and now Hatch Collection use quite a few logistics carriers. So we have EFL, Expeditors, OOCL, we have Vineyard for trucking, you name it, we have it for the various logistics touch points. All of those carriers provide invoices so that they can get paid via PDF, but they're all in completely different formats. They're sent via email. They're not always consistently subjected the same way. Sometimes the recipients aren't always consistent. And just there is an approval process. So because it's in PDF, we're not getting an Excel. I said, okay, well, how are we going to get this data? We'd have to hire 10 people to just sift through all of the PDFs and get that data into an Excel, because at the end of the day, we need to ultimately see how much it costs us to deliver to our warehouse one unit, right? What's that one unit from Thailand versus that one unit from Vietnam? What does it cost if you air it, if you ship it? Do you ship it FCL? Do you ship it LCL? And what does that look like? Because that will ultimately help you make decisions in terms of how you consolidate your inbound freight. So once I was introduced to Parabola, this was kind of the first thing that I said, oh my goodness, we have to set this up. Originally, when we set it up, we were setting up sort of different flows within it. So we'd say, okay, if EFL, then it goes through this path, and it would go through an inbound email with a separate email address. And we set it up for 3 separate providers. And then co-builder came into play, and I said, well, why am I setting up auto forwarding rules from an inbox to 3 separate flows? Because I need it in one place anyway. And what if Microsoft doesn't auto forward correctly, or there's some other issue that happens? So I asked the co-builder, I said, okay, how would I take my existing, back half of the flow, and how do we have one consolidated inbound email pull and be able to filter in the data appropriately from there? So that
Yeah,
was a
there you go.
very
It's a good
long-winded
overview.
way and explanation for how we got to where we are now.
Totally. And when you talk about just the need to actually parse these invoices in the first place, a lot of times when we're working with brands, that maybe they'll mention something like our goal over the next however many periods is to reduce our fully landed costs, right? To get there, you first need actual, consistent, accurate visibility into what you're actually spending across your supply chain. So I think this is a big first step in any of those cost-cutting initiatives. But without further ado, let's actually take a look at the flow here. Sam, I'll turn it over to you to start by talking about this invoice forwarding step that we have set up here, and maybe just kind of starting with the fundamentals. If someone's not familiar with Parabola's ability to integrate via email, can you share a little bit about how this actually works, and then we'll get into the different parsing methods?
Yeah, sure. So in the top left corner where it says send email to, there is when you create the pull from inbound email tile, it will auto generate this email address. And usually we just set up an auto forwarding rule in Outlook. So you set up the auto forwarding rule to say if subject has invoice, or you can set it to look at the body of it, or there's different things, and we'll as Adam scrolls, we'll get into it. But essentially, I set all of the auto forwarding rules for all invoices that we get into a specific shared mailbox to auto forward to this email address. So we did set up a sort of logistics at Janie and Jack inbox so that it auto forwards anything that has an invoice attachment to this email flow.
Awesome. And so instead of people manually opening every single email received in that logistics inbox, they're automatically flowing into Parabola here. And then we get into some rules based on, the subject line, the sender. Walk us through what we kind of have set up down here.
Yeah, sure. So I will admit I first tried to do this in Outlook to see if there was some way that we didn't have to set up the rules, but Outlook is a little bit antiquated, I'll say, and so it was too complicated. So enter the multiple parsing. So for our provider EFL, they normally handle air shipments for us, but they sometimes also handle trucking. So we thought, okay, how are we going to differentiate between the two? So we set up two separate flows for EFL, one for air shipment and one for trucking. For EFL, as a provider, I know that they're actually really good at subjecting their emails. So we base the logic on, okay, if the email subject has invoice-s, I know it's going to be an air shipment. If the email is subjected invoice-t, I know it's going to be a trucking invoice. And so that is how we were able to push that data through. If you scroll down to OOCL, they're a little less consistent. And so I went through a couple of different variations of how are we going to get this in? And I said, okay, well, if the email has someone in it with an OOCL URL in their email, then that's how we're going to handle this. And then that goes through the OOCL parsing, and then Expeditors, who handles some of our trucking, but also customs clearance. We did a similar thing of if the email body includes an Expeditors email. And then lastly, if for whatever reason the parsing doesn't work, or something auto forwarded another invoice from another provider accidentally, it would go to undefined, and we would know how to handle it from there.
Very cool. Awesome overview. And so just to recap before we get into some of the details here, we're automatically forwarding emails received via Outlook directly into this Parabola flow. In the flow, we have the option to parse both the email content and the attachment. So we're talking about the email body, the subject, the sender information. And then instead of just saying, hey, let's parse one PDF format, we're selecting the PDF with multiple formats and an AI option here, which is then allowing us to set up all of these different rules for how we format based on information like subject, body information, file name, so on and so forth. And so
also, Adam, what I will call out is in some of the various steps and various parsing, we did auto detect for certain tables. So because of the different formats, we said, okay, where are you auto detecting this table? Where are you auto detecting that table? And used AI to sort of tell us what would be the most effective way of pulling the data in. And then where maybe it was a little more nuanced, we then defined those terms.
Awesome call out there, and good transition into the actual detail of the configuration here. So in this example, we're looking at an EFL invoice that we can see here. As I scroll, you can see, as Sam called out, the auto-detected table. And do you want to talk a little bit about exactly what we're extracting here and what your experience was like setting this up?
Yeah. So I will admit it was a little bit of trial and error at first. And because there is so much data in the invoice, but it was trying to figure out, okay, what's necessary. In addition to that, you had to keep in mind at the end of the day, we want certain data, not just from EFL, but we want it from OOCL and Expeditors as well. So we didn't want to set it up just for the EFL data because we can still use that same sort of template for the other ones as well. Because let's say, for example, EFL, it's used for air shipment or trucking. You're not going to find a container number in an air shipment. You would find an airway bill number. But in OOCL, it's the reverse, right? So we had to go in and say, okay, what's in this EFL data? And then also then what's missing? So we went through, and also shout out to Sarah, who really helped me with this. I don't want to pretend I did this myself. And we went through to say, okay, well, what's the financial information we need? We obviously want to see when the invoice came in because that will give us the time period of the year. We want to know because we have multiple brands that we will have under the holding company. So we need to differentiate between different brands. The invoices also, I just saw, Adam, that you were showing. We wanted to make sure it was in month, day, full year format because the invoice itself, in some carriers, they did it in one format, some did it in the European format. And so we had to homogenize everything to be it in the format that we expected. We then sort of put more of the financial information of due date and terms and all of that stuff. But the meat of it that, from a logistics standpoint that we really wanted was the airway bill number, the weight, the chargeable weight, how much, what is the ETD, what is the ETA, and the origin and destination, and ultimately the how many cartons we shipped. Because then ultimately what will happen is this will go through a couple of steps that we'll see, and then it can give us a table, and we can then create formulas off of that table and say, okay, well, in a carton we ship this many units, and this is what ultimately what our CPU is for this one shipment.
Super cool. And so here we're parsing, as you said, this EFL invoice. And just to show everyone example of the variety that this step is supporting, in the instance where maybe we are working with an invoice from OOCL, then we're looking at something that looks more like this, obviously a totally different format than the EFL file that we were looking at. And so, yes, the rules are very similar, but a little bit customized depending on where that data is ultimately coming from. And now that we have all of our data parsed, we move on to the rest of the flow. So Sam, can you walk us through what happens once we start filtering for our EFL files?
Yeah, so now as we go through, I really also ultimately, because from a finance perspective, we also want the line items, right? So we want to see, yes, what is being charged for the actual freight, but there's so many accessorials that go into shipping, right? So we wanted to make sure that line items were there. And if you want to go into, and then we also tagged it as being EFL, right? So that we want the data to be, and I'm sure as other logistics and operators know, finance is usually your best friend, right? So you want to make sure you're giving them the data that they would want and they would need as broken out and efficiently as possible. So we tagged this parsing flow as the air shipment EFL flow, which we saw in sort of the beginning in the inbound email. And then we added a column that's tags this as being an EFL provider. And then as we go through, we have the various charges, and then we edit sort of the column names, because it's not necessarily what as a brand and a company that we would want it called. So what EFL calls it, isn't necessarily what makes sense to our brand. And so we went in and sort of renamed all of the columns to what was appropriate for what we were looking for.
Awesome. And so we're kind of mapping the data from EFL's format to your internal format. And then ultimately, we send this data to a Parabola table where there's a lot of other workflows that can then leverage this data to analyze costs, help us figure out CPU, so on and so forth. And so before we transition to one of those downstream flows, prepping for this call and trying to understand exactly what we were doing here, I asked Parabola, how do we know if it's an EFL or an OOCL invoice that'll be parsed here? What's the rule? And so Parabola kind of provided me with exactly what Sam described in this call, with the different parsing rules based on EFL or OOCL. But Sam, would love to hear about your experience working with the AI co-builder here.
I mean, I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with it only because I find that I know what, generally speaking, I want to see as an output, and I don't know exactly how to get there. And so what I've loved about the co-builder is I can sort of just pose a question of, this is what I'm trying to do. Where do I start? What tile do I use? I kind of needed a silver spoon in my mouth, not silver spoon. Like, I need you to spoon feed me how I'm going to do this. And then once sort of that process is started, then I'm saying, okay, great. Now I know what to do. Now it sort of triggers in my mind of, okay, now I get it. And the really cool thing that I love most about the co-builder is when you're going through it, and you're like, okay, well, this doesn't actually look correct, and this is what I was expecting. It then will actually use the data set and the actual data in there. Whereas if you were to do something in ChatGPT, let's say, it will generally tell you, if you're looking for this, you may want to think about a general term. But in Parabola itself, it's actually saying, okay, I think you're trying to get, I don't know, I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now, but you're trying to get to this value. This is the best way that we think you can do it. And so I could talk about that the whole webinar, is how awesome I think co-builder is, but I won't waste everyone's time.
That's amazing. And thank you for the overview. As you said there, when we're chatting, Parabola is actually looking at the data in these steps. It's looking at all the steps you have laid out on the canvas to really give you as informed of an answer as possible. But with that, let's move ahead now to the second flow here, our inbound logistics tracking flow. Sam, can you provide a little overview of what we're actually talking about here?
Yeah. So this is what the team loves to call the spreadsheet. So right now, the spreadsheet is data that's pulled from multiple sources to try and give the best view of what's in transit at any given time at both brands, at Janie and Jack and Hatch. Because it's really manual right now. So not right now, before Parabola. So what we used to do is we would pull POs from a PLM system, a product life management system. We then pull data from what I call TMS Lite system. That's my podium, that's housed by OOCL. We then pull receipts from our warehouse. We are sometimes manually putting in data because it's not readily available to us. And we couldn't sort of figure out the costs and the invoice part of it. So what this is intended to do is be able to be a tool that finance, planning, logistics, and operations at any given time can look and say, okay, I see this is in transit. Okay, this is what our borrowing base could be for this week. Okay, this is supposed to, operations will say, okay, this is supposed to deliver in 2 weeks. I can forecast this to the warehouse. Rather than it being completely manual as it was prior to this flow. So this flow is super complicated, if I do say so myself, but is a work of art, I think, because it really is pulling in all of the disparate systems that the logistics team needed visibility to effectively provide data to the rest of the business.
That's amazing. And I think one of this flow falls into one of my favorite categories of flows, which are flows that now look relatively simple, but are actually really complex because of all the work that you did to make really nice, clean data sets across all of these different sources here. So just zooming in on the left-hand side here, can you kind of walk us through exactly what we're doing in this flow, what the data sources are, and how we're bringing it all together?
Yeah. So DESL, DESL, where you see the little chicken there, that is our PLM system. And that is going to pull in the report of anything that's in transit, what it says is in transit at any given time. And so this is essentially sort of part of what previously was being pulled on a daily basis to see if new POs were being added to say that it's in transit. So this, and then the on top of it is the OOCL report. So OOCL sends through, okay, this is what we see in transit. These are the estimated ETAs, and this report is sent to our inbox daily, and so it would feed into this report to just make sure that that active data is being put in to this report.
Totally. And for those who maybe aren't super familiar with Parabola or just learning, all of this data that we're looking at here, this step is called a Parabola table. These are like databases that live inside Parabola. So behind each one of these data sets is another flow where Sam is building that integration, doing that data cleanup. So yes, this is a nice clean 32,000 row data set, but behind it is a flow that's connected to an SFTP server, pulling this data in, cleaning it. So a lot of complexity you don't see here to actually support all of these steps. But from there, Sam, I'll turn it back over to you to continue walking through.
So then we're combining that data to say, okay, because the DESL report doesn't necessarily have active date changes from OOCL. So, for example, if one of the containers moves out a day or two, which anyone who's in logistics knows happens all the time, constantly, DESL isn't necessarily getting that data. But we need that data because if it moves from 1 week to another, that could have a financial impact in terms of reporting, right? If it was supposed to deliver on the Friday and is now being moved to the Monday, you're in a new week. And sometimes if it's at the end of the month, sort of those types of things can be really, really impactful. So what we're doing is we're tying in the DESL report that the PLM thinks is in transit with the OOCL data and making sure that we can get an accurate time on a daily basis.
It's awesome. So we make sure we have that accurate time coming from the latest data from OOCL, and then we start to tie in some more of our item level data from our FTP server, it looks like.
Yes. So the item data, I think it depends. It depends on who you ask in any brand, right? Some of the item data may make sense to someone who's sourcing. Maybe it makes sense to a planner. Maybe it makes sense to finance. And so we pulled in that data and we attempt to clean it up a little bit to make it so it applies or is sort of user friendly for anyone in the business without having a specific background in item data.
That's awesome. And the data set that ultimately we're looking at here, pretty simple and easy to follow, 38 rows, 19 columns. So that's giving us a really nice base to then join with the decile and OOCL data here. It looks like you're joining that all based on SKU. And we get into some of our POs and receipts.
Yes. So the PO receipts are super important because sometimes we do have data issues, right? So maybe our warehouse shows that it's been received, but it's still showing up on our in transit report for decile because the receipt didn't pull in for whatever reason. And there's a mismatch, right? So what we are trying to do here is to see, okay, is it still showing on the in transit report in decile, but do we have a receipt against it in the warehouse? And then sort of pull that receipt in, and we can then, you'll see later on, we kind of filter that out because we show that it's already been received. So that's
Totally.
the top portion. And then, oh, thank you. I told Adam before I had trouble seeing that zoomed out. I need my glasses. And then, so we combine the in transit with the PO receipts to see what's been received on a daily basis.
Awesome. And then I know previously you had a couple steps here set up to do this. Let's call it the classic way. We have a filter step where we're keeping rows where quantity is not blank, and then we're doing some math to figure out extended cost. But I know you've been loving the custom transform step lately.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about what your experience has been with that step?
So similar to the co-builder, the custom transform has been great because quite honestly, I'm a little lazy. I don't want to create 3 separate steps when I could combine all 3 into one if and where possible. So I've been utilizing it where I can to try and achieve multiple steps within one step. So sub steps in one step. And it's been a really awesome way of doing that.
Has that step slash introduction of the AI chat changed the way that you kind of advise your teammates at Janie and Jack to approach learning Parabola?
Yeah, for sure, because it also helps you become more self-sufficient. And so I think that's the goal of this ultimately, right? You don't have to be a coder, you don't have to have an IT background to be able to use Parabola. And you use it like you do ChatGPT or some of the other um, things out there where you're just asking a question and it's saying, oh, well, have you thought of doing it this way? And you're like, oh, actually, that's really smart. Let's try and do this. And it's kind of a friend helping you along the way, which has been really cool, especially because it's reading the data that you already have in there. So I'm a huge fan.
Well said. That's awesome. Very cool. Well, we get to the end of this flow where now, if we remember our EFL and OOCL data, we're pulling that in, we're stacking it, and you want to kind of take us home in this flow?
Yeah, so what's happening is then at some point we'll get an invoice for the POs that were previously in transit, and we can then pull in that information. We'll see how many units were delivered, and then we'll be able to do some math in the background to say, okay, how much are we spending on this container? How many units were in it? And what then ultimately is our end freight CPU. The goal of that ultimately is to also then get the data on a monthly basis and then a weekly basis. And we then can start stacking everything and we can see kind of the ebbs and flows more appropriately than when maybe anyone in the logistics world knows that costs go up in late December and January. Well, I guess late November, January, because they're preparing for Lunar New Year, right? And so now we're going to actually have the data rather than saying, oh, it's going to go up by 10% because that's what we think it will go up by. We actually can see, all right, on a unit, like this is going to cost for knitwear, it's going to cost this amount because knitwear takes up more space. And so it has more volume. and more volume means more dollars, right? And so you really can then get more specific into actual product type because we're pulling in all of the item data from our PLM originally, and we can flow through everything to get extremely nuanced.
That's awesome. I'm excited to see once you have really built up that database of historical cost data, some of the dashboards, visualizations, decisions you're able to make off of that data once you have that all together. But Sam, this was a really awesome walkthrough. And before we transition over to Q&A, anything else you want to add about this flow? Any other general thoughts or advice you want to share here?
No, I think honestly, my advice is I think at first, I'll be frank, like Parabola seemed a little overwhelming to me. I was like, oh my goodness, where do I start? It actually gives you a blank canvas, right? And you're like, what do I do? And with especially some of the new additions with Custom Transform and Co-Builder, this has actually gotten me really excited to better utilize all of the data that we do have at our fingertips without really bogging down the team. Because this is manual stuff that used to be, 20 different V lookups every single day handled by 5 separate people. So this really, really helps streamline so that we can focus on what we really need to focus on, which is expense, trying to get our expenses down and making sure we're being more effective and consolidating shipments where we can and focusing on that more.
Totally. I think we'd all agree, not the best use of your time or anyone else's time on the team to just be parsing PDFs by hand all day
Yes.
long. But Sam, that overview is great. We'll take this time to transition to a little Q&A. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And while we wait for some questions to roll in, Sam, one question I have for you. Obviously, we talked about PDF parsing today. We talked about tracking in transit. Curious what's next for you at Janie and Jack when you think about what other opportunities are out there to deploy new automations or problems you're excited to solve?
I'm excited to work with my warehouse counterpart who the warehouse is kind of the next step in the supply chain for us to really see, okay, well, we were expecting to receive these amount of units, right? And we show that the supplier shipped this many, but we maybe only received in, a third of it. Who knows? We are shipping so much inventory at any given time. It's not feasible for someone to go in and manage that at all, period, right? Not even monthly, right? So trying to get more data to be able to see where some of the deltas are and try and fix along the way where some of the issues may be because we may not even know that the issue exists yet.
Totally. And the use case of this basically three-way match between our original invoice, our receipt at the warehouse, and then the invoice. That's one of the most common use cases for Parabola. So I can definitely share a little template there to help you get started, Sam.
Great.
But with that, thank you very much for joining everyone today. And Sam, thank you so much again for this session. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've had a handful of awesome sessions this week. In case you missed them, Vince had an awesome session on OTIF reporting on Monday. Mallory ran us through QBR reporting and invoice digitization on Tuesday. And yesterday, Chris had an awesome walkthrough of inventory allocations. All these sessions are available on YouTube. And tomorrow, Crystal will be showing us how her team automated end-of-month financial reporting with Parabola. But Sam, thank you so much for this. This was a really awesome session.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.